The democracy born of a free land, strong in selfishness and individualism, intolerant of administrative experience and education, and pressing individual liberty beyond its proper bounds, has its dangers as well as its benefits. Individualism in America has allowed a laxity in regard to governmental affairs, which has rendered possible the spoils system and all the manifest evils that follow from the lack of a highly developed civic spirit. Frederick Jackson Turner, July 12th, 1893.
The Sporting Goods Manufacturers Association says that Ultimate is the fastest growing segment. It's going worldwide. Dr. Tom Crawford, February 1st, 2012, in the Wharton Business Journal.
This is Huck and Hope, Episode 2, the fastest growing sport in the nation. Hello and welcome to Huck and Hope. I'm Patrick Stegemoeller.
And I'm Brian Kibler.
We're here in episode 2 to talk about Ultimate Frisbee, which was apparently, at one time, I don't know if you've heard this, Brian, it was the fastest growing sport in the nation. Have you heard that? Did you hear about that at any point?
I think if you were in the sport in any capacity between 2012 and 2015, you heard that. You heard that a lot.
And it made you feel okay about things, right?
It made me feel like I would be able to talk about Frisbee at family functions at some point in the next decade.
We're referring, of course, to a study, finding, data, but certainly a line that got plucked out and bandied about by anyone trying to make a legitimate enterprise out of Frisbee around the turn of the decade, which was that the Sporting Goods Manufacturers Association of America said that Ultimate was the fastest growing sport in the nation based on, I guess, the growth of participation that the sporting goods would have tracked. I've never been entirely clear on how a Sporting Goods Manufacturing Association was going to pull that number, but hey, we didn't care. You know, we didn't want to investigate that.
We also, at least I didn't know that it was sporting goods manufacturers who had said that it wasn't like execs at ESPN, you know?
The reason that we're talking about it is because this mentality, fueled specifically by this quote, really had a time where we all thought that things were good and they were just going to get better forever, and that Frisbee was going to be, like you said, something you could talk about with your family and have them understand what you were saying. You know, let's take our listeners back. It's, 2011, 2012, Obama was president. The internet was still good. Everything felt, if not possible, at least plausible. And it seemed as though everything that you were kind of investing your time and energy in, it was a good investment. It was good to do that. But we wanted to talk about this period of time because this is the period of time that the Rochester Dragons were born into, the AUDL arose out of, and that a lot of the sort of main players that we have interviewed and that are relevant to our story were featured in.
I remember this as a brief moment in which the priorities of the major institutions seemed like they were aligned with the common good. The internet and all of the tech companies associated with it were minting billionaires, but they were also democratizing information. You could learn calculus on YouTube or collaborate with someone in real time who lived in Australia. Social media helped spark the Arab Spring Revolution in 2011. I mean, we were thinking of Facebook as a pro-democracy force at this point. Our early 20s were characterized by this trust in the economic and governmental institutions, and it sort of trickled into the sport of Ultimate. That led to this belief that we should put our faith in the major institutions of sport in America, i.e., we should pursue Olympic recognition and we should build professional sports leagues. We thought that doing this would be good for every Ultimate player.
It's a time when USA Ultimate is inking a deal with ESPN because we're just going to let the gears of institutional pop culture turn and carry us down a calming, lazy river to success. Now, is it ESPN3? Sure. Is no one going to discover the sport via this way? Because you'd have to scroll through 4 different menus to find a thing that you already didn't care about. And then maybe you'll see it and want to make it a big part of your lifestyle. It was just not a time where you were asking those sorts of questions, because you were kind of like, there's a plan. It's all great. We're all going to be a part of it. And Frisbee is just going to become another thing. It's going to last forever.
It's important to acknowledge at this point, because it's going to come in later in the story, that there were people in the Frisbee community that absolutely didn't believe this. And I would imagine it's the people who were maybe a little older, maybe a little savvier, and had a little bit less trust in the traditional institutions and infrastructures of America.
But boy, the movers and shakers, it was their time. What it was it was a boomtown. It was a time due to a confluence of technology and politics and culture. And initially it felt like we had struck gold or oil or whichever commodity you want to fill in here, because it was a period where stuff was changing and happening. You know, it went from a time where you had to send away to have someone mail you a DVD of a highlight package of games that had happened 3 months ago to, oh my gosh, Next Gen Network exists and I can just stream games. I can just watch them live in my dorm room. Sick. This will just continue to exist and will forever.
It definitely did feel like this, you know, both in Frisbee and the world, because the internet and sort of technological exponential growth is amazing. We just hadn't realized that it could also like try to turn you into a Nazi yet. That hadn't come up.
Right.
And there actually was like this sudden, astonishing explosion in Ultimate Frisbee content, in watchability, availability, but we hadn't taken our foot off the gas enough to consider the ramifications of all of it and to try to see what it could lead to.
And so into this petri dish of optimism and ignorance, boomtown vibes, is born the AUDL, the Buffalo Hunters, and eventually, as a result, the Rochester Dragons. And I think that this framing is important because it allows you to maybe understand why someone, the owner of the Dragons, Lee Semrau, who purchased the team for $2,500 on Craigslist, despite having almost no background in Ultimate Frisbee, would feel like they wanted to get in on something. Because when there is a gold rush, you don't have to know all that much about gold to want to be in on it.
There are other people involved which you generally feel bad about, like their passion for sports and wanting to win and like be around when this takes off. Because there is that general feeling, even from year one, that like people had of like, this is going to work. And when you think something is going to work, you don't want to miss it.
That's Tim DeBile, owner of the Madison Radicals and chief operating officer of the AUDL.
Lee was convinced that this was going to take off someday, and he did not want to get left behind. I just think that like that's the thing I remember is like we're generally trying to convince people to spend more money, and like in his case, we're like trying to convince him to not spend more money, right? In a location that doesn't make sense with a, you know, and we'll call it an interesting group of players. Like Lee, you know, like don't put yourself into lifelong debt for this.
And it wasn't just people trying to buy franchises into the AUDL. There were a lot of people trying to carve out their own thing in Ultimate that were feeling the optimism, whether it was in media or apparel or coaching. A lot of different avenues were suddenly open. And two of the most prominent individuals who stood out during this period, even, you know, to people like you and I who were just D3 dipshits in upstate New York, were Mario O'Brien and Kevin Minderhout.
It's actually hard to overstate the degree to which Mario and Kevin influenced the culture. Mario started an instructional video series called Rise Up, in which he taught the ropes of high-level Ultimate. I remember it was the first time I felt like I was being taught Frisbee by someone who actually knew what they were talking about, rather than some dude who played mixed in the same town as my college.
guys, I'm Mario O'Brien, and in partnership with Sky Magazine and Ben Wiggins, this is Rise Up. An ultimate renaissance is happening as we speak. The sport and community are thriving. But something is still missing. Most of the ultimate community has limited access to people and resources that can actually help them improve as teams and players. Our goal is to create engaging instructional videos that motivate and empower players at any skill level to call a friend, grab a disc, and immediately improve their game. The mission of Rise Up is to improve the level of play of ultimate teams and players through the creation.
The main pathway that allowed people to start thinking like that was the combination of social media, specifically with video on social media. There started to be this connectivity within the worldwide ultimate community that we're not just each in our own community seeing the people in our community. We started to be able to literally see other people in other communities. I don't know if my goal was like, I really want everyone to know about this. I think at least for me personally, I'm always trying to be conscious of the impact that I'm having on the communities that I'm in, whether it's as a teacher, it's the classroom, or when I'm coaching, it's the team. And then I was like, oh, there's a way that I could have a bigger impact and help more people and plug in that way. And it wasn't about wanting to spread the sport to the biggest possible. It was just personal to me, wanting to give and connect and teach and lead and stuff like that.
Do you remember following his stuff, Pat?
Yeah, absolutely. And because he seemed famous to me in a way that people hadn't before in Ultimate, because he played on Rhino and he was in Chasing Sarasota, which was a honest to God documentary about Rhino's 2011 season. He seemed like, this would have been the vernacular at the time, he seemed like a thing. He seemed like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's charismatic. I recognize him from a movie. He's an elite athlete in the sport. And it just seemed totally normal that this person should be capitalizing on that and trying to make it happen.
And I think maybe the only other person and piece of kind of ultimate related media that influenced me more than Rise Up at the time was the Next Gen Tour, which was created by a guy named Kevin Minderhout.
Hi, I'm Dylan Freechild. People often ask me, Dylan, how do you get prepared for the Next Gen Tour?
It said specifically on the first Next Gen Tour, there was an about page, and that was part of it is so that people can know that there is something better. I didn't know Rhino. There was better Frisbee in my city. I was in Portland. Rhino was quite good at the time. I didn't know Rhino existed until I went to school at the University of Oregon. And so part of my mission statement of the Next Gen Tour was to actually correct exactly your experience and my experience.
He was sort of the behind the scenes guy, whereas Mario was a little more in front of the camera. And they came out of that same Portland scene that was happening at the time. But Kevin put together not only the Next Gen Tour, which was one of the first things that created celebrity in the ultimate sphere, which was a bunch of men's college all-stars, threw them on a bus, drove around the country, played elite club teams, and along the way created both kind of the idea of what a Frisbee celebrity is in a digital world. And that ended up, of course, becoming sort of the stepping stone towards the All-Star Tour, which is the women's college division all-star team that goes and plays against elite club teams. So a lot comes out of this time, and Kevin is one of the key figures responsible for it.
As I think back on it, there was nothing that made the sport feel more legitimate to me than the Next Gen Tour. That was the first time I felt like it could work as a spectator sport and that we might be able to make other people care.
So this was 2013, was the third and final iteration of the tour. And I remember that summer being like, oh, this is awesome. A couple nights a week, I'll watch Frisbee. This will be great. And then it was the last year of it, which in a way might have been a little bit of a canary in a coal mine, because it was something that had such a universal appeal and seemingly was so successful, but then got discontinued. And at the time, I don't think we saw all the signs of, wow, burnout is a big deal when you're trying to do something like this that doesn't actually make money in a conventional, profitable way. And progress isn't just going to be linear because you've done something once that is good and that people like. It's going to ebb and flow. And while it didn't really click at the time, the end of the Next Gen Tour was a sign of what was to come for many franchises in the AUDL, to say the least.
I'll tell you what the atmosphere was. I guess it's like any boom cycle, right? There was an almost irrational belief in the trajectory of Frisbee. The experience that we made with the live streaming, it felt like that's like 1,000% jump or whatever, right? It's like, if it grows 1,000% every couple of years, we're going to be like worldwide. And people were irrational about it. They were. I had a conversation. I sat down with Greg Connolly and Matthew Skip Sewell in Seattle about MLU. So I was like, what do you think the chance of success of this is? I think Skip was the more, he was convinced it was like going to be successful. I was like, there's like a 15%. That's a very generous 15% chance. So that was part of what made it hard to sustain. Why I left was because it was like, I was sort of surrounded by irrational exuberance. I enjoyed what I was doing, but I was a little bit realistic.
So the most exciting version of this energy is this effervescent group of college kids barnstorming across the country, beating elite club teams, and everyone who plays the sport is paying attention and getting really excited. Another version of this energy was Lee Semrau purchasing an AUDL franchise with the goal of bringing professional sports to Western New York. And once he made this purchase, he was faced with a legitimately intimidating number of logistical hurdles.
My official title has changed throughout the years. I started off as the vice president of operations. The first year as the Dragons, I actually was the head coach to get us off the ground in Rochester a little bit. Pretty much did anything and everything on game day that needed to be done. Most times you could find me up in the sound booth. I had one particular game where I was also the trainer on site for the day and was running between the sound booth and being on the field and whatever role needed to be filled that particular day.
This is Chris Smith, who wore many hats for the Rochester Dragons.
Lee Semrau is actually my father-in-law. So I had gone to his house for one particular weekend or get together, and he was making this question like, hey, have you ever heard about, Ultimate Frisbee? And I'm like, yeah, I have. Why? I'm like, why would you know about it? And he's just like, well, I bought a team. What do you mean you bought a team? And he started talking to me about this. I was like, this can't be real. And a couple of weeks later had passed, and he had gone to an owner's meeting or something, and he brought me this big 3-ring binder that I think was like 6 inches thick, full of everything that needed to be done and replicated and produced and time frames and all these other things. And I was looking at it with him. I'm going, there's no way you can do this on your own. And I said, why don't I come on board and I'll help you where I can with this. And from there, we had to create a team name. We had to come up with colors. We had to come up with websites and designs and figure out who we could talk to even recruit people who knew anything about Ultimate Frisbee, because we didn't know.
They may not have known much about starting an Ultimate Frisbee team, but Lee did know that he wanted to purchase a live buffalo as a mascot for the team. And this is confirmed by several of the stakeholders of the team.
That was what the meetings were like. Lee would be like, I want to buy a buffalo. It's got to be our mascot. It was like straight from Ace Ventura. We're the Miami Dolphins. We're going to have a dolphin. And me and Chris talking him off the ledge.
This is Sean Donnellan, at one point a coach, a player. What else was he, Pat?
I mean, he was sort of like the team's bag man. He did what needed to get done and didn't ask too many questions about it.
Yeah, met guys in parking garages, exchanged
Right.
envelopes.
Exactly. Sort of like Mike from Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul talked some of the more fiery actors down out of doing things like, say, trying to purchase a live buffalo.
So they would yell at each other a lot, and then we try and figure out how to move forward. And then ultimately I would guide them, be like, we have this event. We should think about booking it and paying for it and all that. So, but it was definitely an impulsive thing, and it wasn't a get rich thing. I would probably guess, because I was involved in the finances and the budget and the other stuff, between paying the Pittsburgh guys for gas money, for the endorsements that he gave to Rob Doulabon, for Doulabon bonds at a local Buffalo bakery. Lee was a very generous guy, so much so that we were like, if you buy a Buffalo, we are literally not going to be able to have a season and like pay our very few bills.
Imagine the cost of upkeep, trying to keep it alive. I mean, the liability of just having a Buffalo. I mean, there weren't that many fans at these games, but
How much alfalfa do you think a buffalo eats a week? How much grain? What do buffaloes eat?
I don't know, okra?
It can't be cheap though. Whatever they eat.
Just one of them going loose at a game and goring all 17 fans who were there. And look, it's easy to look back and throw stones at a brainstorm. You're coming up with ideas. You know, it was an exciting time, and clearly something that the ownership of the Dragons, at the time the Hunters, were excited about. There's a certain joy to the process of coming up with stuff. I do think that blank canvas also led to some interesting happenings that actually came to pass. It was a bunch of college teams, some short lifespan club teams being cobbled together, no coaches. There was no infrastructure for selling concessions, referees. I mean, let's talk about the early days of AUDL officiating. We can talk specifically from our perspective on the Dragons, where it was like high school football referees who had to have the rules explained to them right before the game. Pretty sure that Bill Abbott, who was the GM of the Dragons, reffed a game at one point.
Do you think that's a conflict of interest? Would that register as one?
Well, I mean, I think he was self-loathing enough that he could play it straight. But there was no infrastructure to train referees. It had not existed before in the history of the sport. And all of a sudden, you're saying, hey, couple dudes who didn't really know that much about Frisbee until you bought a team on Craigslist, produce some referees for us, please. And that's going to lead to some weird calls.
Do you remember our first tryout that was also a practice, when our coaching staff basically explained, hey, these refs, it's all they can do to legislate the mark and the thrower.
Mm-hmm.
What happens downfield essentially stays downfield, and we're going to defend as if no one's watching. And we were taught to basically just play defense with your elbow in someone's ribs.
I mean, really leaning into the Wild West vibes that we are assigning to this period. The stall count was entirely arbitrary. You would have some stall counts that were 12 seconds long, some that were about 4. And it's not like when you're playing USAU rules where the count is happening on the mark. It's a silent count by a referee who's 30 yards away. It just created a sort of sense of paranoia when you had the disc, or at least that was my experience of just being out of time and not knowing, do I have 2 seconds? Do I have 8 seconds to make this throw? It was an interesting experience. There were some refs who they just had to like dig up and give them like, hey, here's $40. Just like go out there, put a shirt on. I mean, just try to not stand out. Like just try to not make any calls that really alter the game.
I got to say the stall count was not the only reason I was panicking when holding the disc against Anatoly Vasilyev and those guys. Yeah, no, I mean, it really was the Wild West. And to carry the analogy farther, Matt Bode one time stopped me from fouling him by threatening to actually kill me. And it worked. So in that
frontier
sense,
justice.
That's true
frontier justice.
And I didn't deserve actual death, but you know, it was fair. It was fair.
And it wasn't just referees. Coaching was a grab bag too. I mean, we got very lucky that for the whole time we were on the Dragons, Brian Jones came aboard and coached the team. I mean, he did just use us as a stepping stool to propel himself to fame and actual legitimacy within the community. But the coaching situation at a lot of these early teams was because, again, it wasn't mostly in hubs, and it wasn't usually through a lot of like big existing club infrastructure. You had some weird situations. I remember we got an email from someone who was on the first season of the DC Breeze, far cry from the Daryl Stanley helmed program that they are now. And we have to read this to you to really get a sense of what the brain trust situation was like on a lot of these early AUDL teams. The coach during tryouts was Tom Coffin, who brought a disc golf basket and practiced his putting during tryouts. Tryouts were otherwise pretty normal. A couple of drills were weirdly organized or set up, but nothing too far out of the ordinary. However, a good portion of the team threatened to quit before the first game because, among other things, Coffin literally wouldn't share the team playbook with anyone on the team because he was afraid we'd leak it. I remember one particular chalk talk where he drew a horizontal stack on the whiteboard and spoke in generalities like, "This is where the action is," while pointing to the upfield cutters, who he believed should actually be the handlers because of some logic about having your fast guys closer to your own end zone in case you turn it or something. I wish I were kidding about any of this.
I'm pretty sure this was just Felix teaching hex under a pseudonym.
Yeah, it was a laboratory for him. You know, he was like, I have an opportunity here to try my ideas out. So that, I think, is a good example of the fly-by-night, yeah, okay, we'll give just about anybody authority over other people. You could be the coach and tell people what to do. It was this cosplaying of we're being a professional sports franchise, so we need coaches, we need referees, produce them. Hey, disc golf guy who knows where the action is, you're a coach now.
This guy clearly saw Any Given Sunday and was just like, that's what a football coach is. I'll be a coach.
And it extended to things about the entire operation of the franchise. What do professional sports leagues have? Well, people sing the national anthem before games start, so I guess we're going to do that. It's kind of weird that we do that in major professional sports. It's very weird that the AUDL decided to import that into its own programming as well. And it led to weird results like not having Chris Stapleton to do the national anthem before a Dragons game. It's not the Super Bowl. So instead, we're going to have a guy on the Dragons, Gabe Hage, sprint out of the player intro line, haul ass up like 80 stairs of bleachers to where the press booth was on top of the stadium, while out of breath, sing the national anthem on pitch, and then run back down onto the field to play. Because we're a professional sports team. We just got to do stuff like this. You got to have a national anthem, I guess. It was cosplaying in a wild, chaotic fashion, and it led to some really surreal moments.
Still one of the most impressive things I've ever seen on a Frisbee field. Full stop.
For him to have the breath control, I mean, it was a tall bleacher. It was 60 to 80 steps that he sprinted up in cleats on metal, reflecting across the largely empty field, and then crushed the national anthem with, his Gabe Hage was a guy who sort of had a look and a voice like a World War I fighter pilot, but it had a certain pleasing, nasally tone to it when he sang the anthem.
Sure,
that was good.
Yeah, sure.
Another thing Gabe Hage did one time was while BJ was giving us tactics talk during halftime of a game, just started doing karate moves in the corner of the locker room, and then just sort of arbitrarily in the middle of one of DJ's points just started screamed, "Turn down for what?" and sprinted out of the locker room, hyped up and ready to play defense. I guess that was his process.
I think we've shown great restraint by only having 2 stories of Gabe Hage so far. I remember up until, I believe it was 2019, the New York Empire had one of their players, Elliot Lee, I believe, playing the national anthem on trumpet. We had an American flag patch on our shoulder, on our jerseys. So many examples of us just clearly poorly mimicking professional sports stuff. Like the Buffalo Hunters had a combine before they really even had a tryout, and they were hand timing 40-yard dashes. And the legend was that Kevin Quinlan ran a 4.3 second 40 timed on someone's iPhone. And this was talked about in fairly reverent tones a couple years after the fact.
If he actually ran a 4.340, he'd be a starting cornerback in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a chance he'd be trying out for the Buffalo Hunters. I mean, it's just another example of a long history of ultimate Frisbee players trying to establish their sort of athletic bona fides with athletic metrics, like the Bo Kittredge broad jump.
Right. Bo, for those of you who don't know, Bo Kittredge, one of the greatest Frisbee players of all time, no question about it, put out a Skied magazine blog post on his Bo Knows blog series. You should go check it out. I mean, I miss blogs, back. I remember we talked about this was back when the internet was good. Were all blog posts good? No, as demonstrated by this one. But blogs were a purer expression of the internet than whatever we have going on today. Anyways, he posted on a blog about how he was like, I probably could have been an NFL player, but I chose to play Frisbee instead because I could broad jump 12 feet, which is ludicrous. And Bo would have gotten torn limb from limb if he tried to actually play for the Oakland Raiders, as he said that he painstakingly agonized over whether he should give up his ideals of Frisbee or sell out for the bright lights and big bucks of the NFL.
If that was ever an option for him, he fucked this up so bad.
People wasted money on Frisbee by buying AUDL franchises that went nowhere, but no one would have wasted more money than Bo if he actually had a shot at playing in the NFL.
One year of the veteran minimum would have been the biggest windfall in the sports history. So everyone's just sort of winging it, and it's leading to a lot of pretty hilarious stuff, but it's important to remember that there are a number of people, including Lee Semrau, who are bought in with real U.S. currency.
Yeah, like mortgage money.
Mortgage money, presumably food money, buffalo money.
Wherever dollars are accepted.
Usually it's the owner making the decision on their own that this isn't for them. And I think Lee is one of the few people who I remember just always feeling like trying to convince him to stop because, it's almost like save him from himself, right? Because he didn't have the money. He wasn't good at it. He didn't have any background in sports or marketing or anything, but man, he just was so passionate about making it work. And yeah, was just willing to mortgage his home over it. And I think we literally convinced him not to mortgage his home at one point to keep this going.
So this idea of it's a boom town and now we have to build a town. Now we have to build a team. Now we have to cosplay as a legitimate professional sports franchise is funny for sure. But I do think it was actually kind of harmful in some ways too, to the future success and sustainability of a lot of this, and also didn't address the actual problems with a lot of mainstream sports culture at the time. I think the biggest one, of course, is the gender equity imbalance, where we were so concerned about just getting this town built, just getting this league put up, that we didn't stop to think at all about is it messed up that it's only a men's league? Is that bad? Is that weird? And it wasn't until 3, 4, 5 years later when the AUDL boycott, which was an effort put forth by a combination of elite club players and some AUDL players and non-AUDL players, to, at various levels, either not play in the league or not watch the league or not support the league. And it was sort of the culmination of a larger conversation about gender equity that the early days of the AUDL just completely ignored, I think, in a rush to just emulate. We have to be the NFL ASAP. Let's do this, because that's a legitimate and viable goal for us to have, and not crazy pants fantasy time when we can actually be thinking about how to build a better, survivable, sustainable way to do professional Frisbee.
It represents basically that same blind trust in institutions and, frankly, capitalism that led to us plunging forward and not really considering the ramifications.
Well, and also why replicate it? Why are we did we slow down enough? Did the people in power with money slow down enough to, or do they even care? I don't know. Maybe when it's just when your money's wrapped up in it, you don't ask that question. But replicate. You just said replicate. Do we need another NFL in this world?
This is Jesse Schaffner, one of the most influential players of the broadcast era and an organizer of the AUDL boycott.
Like, is the goal actually to like blueprint major sports leagues? Is that what we want? Like, and if not, what does it look like? What can it look like? And how much time have we spent on that? Instead of we're like so cart in front of the horse, it felt like we were just falling over ourselves in that time frame. Like you're talking about, to get to this thing that we were pretending we already had without any thought around like what lines are we crossing in our eagerness to get to this other place. And have we thought for a second about like what that looks like, what that means in sacrifice, what we're giving up, what we're trading off for it, who we're giving power. But we were just so excited. We were so excited, you know?
It was the sense that culture that we had created, that we had discovered, just had the answers for everything. Sure, were some people going to have to wait a little bit longer than others to have their due? Yeah, okay, but we're all on the same upward trajectory, the same escalator to Mount Olympus, and it's going to all be fine. And that was not a super helpful attitude, it turned out, because at this point, people had really bought in, and real money was on the line. It was happening. The league was going to have games. The games were going to be seen by some amount of people, and the sport was going to be changed forever by the actions that occurred during this sort of frothy period of opportunity and capitalism.
Yeah, the sport did sort of credibly seem like it was maybe the fastest growing sport in America, but we really didn't know what it was growing into.
And that, dear listener, is where we'll leave you for this episode. But next time, we're going to examine what this Frankenstein frontier cowboy monster ended up looking like and how the dragons fit into that whole puzzle. So make sure you check out the next episode of Huck and Hope. Huck and Hope is an Ultiworld podcast produced by Lindsay Sue. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email the show at huckandhope@ultiworld.com.
If you've enjoyed the show so far, become an Ultiworld subscriber to hear the rest of the story. Next time on Huck and Hope.
It does seem like they respected us a little bit at the beginning of the game, and then they realized that they didn't have to at all.
Honored to be involved in the signature moment of your best player getting D'd.
I mean, I was like not at all mentally prepared for the like absolute onslaught of negative criticism online that I received at the age of like 23.